Thank you. That was delightful. Dear God, be patient with us. Give us encouragement, strength. Open our eyes in ways we have not been able to see. Amen. So this, Tom's reading was troubling, not because he read troubling in a troubling way, but because the words are so troubling. I mean, the whole thing was fraught with weird and torturous questions about God closing women's wombs and gender and child rearing in a temple by a man. Oh my God. And petitionary prayers. And it all springs from the most basic yearning in the world, as basic as a vessel longing to be filled. That longing pervades the following poem by Andrea Potus. And my hope is that this poem might offer empathy and an ounce of comfort to those who know what this problem Hannah is going through feels like firsthand, and also help everyone else get at least a glimpse of the pain and the longing behind it all. The poem's called "To My Still Unconceived Daughter." My relatives ask me why I'm taking so long to have you. They don't know that each week I name you Arista, Helena, Penelope. How I see you in the nook of my arm, your dark curls damp on my skin. How I buy dolls and explain they're for me. The African doll with black braids, hand-painted lips. The rag doll with red yarn hair, fleecy green pajamas, silk-stitched mouth. They are part of the widening circle on my bed, with a honeyed bear softer than pillows. I tuck under my arm at night placeholders until the day I recall you from reverie, until I am large enough to contain you, to bear love's pressure on the walls of my heart. To bear love's pressure on the walls of my heart. Some pain in life recedes with time, but this pain is one that may actually increase as the years go by. It's one I have direct connection with, though from the male side. Hannah's husband, Elkanah, he's pretty obtuse about this thing. The text tells us that Hannah traveled every year with her husband and her sister wife, Peninnah, to the sanctuary in Shiloh, which was sort of a mini temple before King Solomon's full-on temple was built. And this trip they made was part of an annual pilgrimage holiday. Peninnah was more of a rival than a sister wife, really. And she has this posse of kids to share the potluck barbecue that ensues after the required ritual sacrifices. But Hannah, being childless, sits out the party, sulking as one would, even though being the favored wife, she got the pick of the short ribs and her husband's favored affections. When Elkanah says, "Come on, honey, aren't I dearer to you than 10 sons?" Hannah has a meltdown. The man honestly thought he was making things better, but husbands are so often tone deaf when it comes to that kind of comfort. It might have helped had he said instead, "Darling, don't you know that you are dearer to me than 10 sons? Am I right here, or am I just getting in deeper?" Anyway, here's a story told by a modern-day Hannah, a woman named Megan from Massachusetts. She says, "Our reproductive endocrinologist," easy for me to say, said, "It looks like you're headed toward in vitro fertilization," after another month of unsuccessful treatments. 3 years of trying and failing to conceive a child was weighing heavily on my husband and me and on our marriage. As the doctor described the next round of treatments, I felt a familiar knot form in my throat. The injected medicines I'd taken so far had caused terrible headaches. To me, the doctor's words meant more injections, more hormones, more bloating, more headaches. I saw myself 12 weeks in the future, curled up in a little ball on our bed, crying after yet another failed attempt. I told the doctor I didn't understand what wasn't working, that my husband and I were both healthy. She said again that 15% of infertility is unexplained. My husband listened seriously, nodded his head, and said, "I understand." The doctor handed my husband a lab slip. "This is for you," she said. "We need you to get some blood work done in order to have the treatments approved by your insurance." Wordlessly, we walked to the lab. While my husband had his blood drawn, I sat in the waiting room and imagined the lab technician wiping his arm with alcohol and tying a tourniquet around it. "Just a little stick," she'd say. "You won't feel a thing." "Please," I whispered, "please let him feel some pain." Back to the text. Poor Hannah storms out. She enters this sanctuary where she lets her agony out in tears and supplication. She cries, she trembles, she pours her heart out, and she does it in the terrible silence of a woman so broken she can't even find her own voice. Her whispered prayer is deep and real. The text tells us how she begs for a child, even cutting a deal with God in the way, the kind of thing that thousands of infantrymen did the night before the invasion of Normandy in 1944. But Hannah's bargain with God involves offering to dedicate her future child to a life of service in the sanctuary if she can only give birth to him. Now, we just elected a vice president who demeaned what he called childless cat ladies. Remember? Some of us thought that might be enough to disqualify him. Well, I'm also a man, and I'm in over my head with this subject, but let me just say that praying for a child is just as legitimately feminist as to pray for any other awesome achievement in life. Well, Hannah's prayer was unique because back then in those days, nobody prayed silently, nobody prayed emotionally, and nobody prayed alone. You showed up at the sanctuary with your family, you said some prayers over the cow or sheep that you intended to sacrifice on the altar, and then you went your way. Hannah's agency in setting her own prayer was groundbreaking and totally against the norms of the time, as the old patriarch Eli the priest made clear when he came upon her. While Hannah's prayer here, really a deep, heartfelt cry, is a breath of fresh air in the Jewish prayer tradition, it wasn't good enough for Eli the priest, who demanded that she remove her drunken self from the place until she sobered up. "How much longer are you going to make a spectacle of yourself?" he says. "Go home, you're drunk." Well, you definitely don't want to be cast as any of the men in a dramatic version of this folktale. If you are, my advice would be to just shut up and say nothing. But Hannah wasn't having it. She initiates a dialogue that would pass the biblical version of Hollywood's Bechdel test. Now, I don't know if you know about that, but to pass the Hollywood Bechdel test, a film or TV episode has to satisfy 3 points. It has to include at least 2 women. They have to have at least one conversation, and it needs to be about something other than a man. Well, in this biblical story, we have a woman talking back to a man about her fate, rather than submitting to his verbal abuse and scorn. In other words, she lets the priest Eli have it. "I'm a woman of broken spirit, and I'm just here to pray. I haven't had a drop to drink. I'm just in touch with my emotions in a healthy way, and that means that when my heart is breaking, all I want is one thing. I'm going to damn well show up and pray my guts out to God. I mean, isn't that what this sanctuary is for?" Hannah says to her priest, "Don't take me for a crazy fool. I'm here to pray, and you can help me by blessing me, asking God to, grant my prayer, which is your job." I may be paraphrasing here a little. Oh, Eli does bless her, and spoiler alert, she does conceive, birthing the prophet Samuel. And Hannah's story is a lesson for silenced women and men, all men who need to stop talking and start listening without judgment. So, what do we do with this? Thanksgiving Day is nearly here. And I am already praying for divided families all over this country who are headed to that table this year, right? From all over. So many of them carrying deep hurt, resentment, incredulousness. And part of that divide is about gender and attitudes about gender. We will need to advocate for, or at least offer comfort to, the Hannahs among us who will show up at those tables, who might be afraid to speak up. We will need to listen when some of them struggle to formulate the words as Hannah struggled. We will need to remember that their silence can be just as telling as prayers that scream and shout. I'm guessing that at most tables, there'll be a silent agreement to lay off divisive topics, right? But it's going to be difficult any way you cut this turkey. I've been having a hard time listening to the news this week. I bet you have too. My heart isn't ready to take much of it in. I'm just feeling way too tender. But I did listen to a half-hour interview with David Brooks, who writes for the New York Times and the Atlantic, and he cautioned us that wherever we are these days, at a coffee shop or a grocery store or Thanksgiving dinner table this year, especially if we're invited to show up to eat with strangers, to be careful of stereotyping other people. Here's what he said. He said he was a Reagan Republican in the 1980s because he thought the best political thinking then was from the right. Now he's a Democrat. He used to teach at Yale, but in time, Yale just felt so insulated from the real world to him, an Ivy League cocoon. So now he travels the country for his work, talking to people, mostly listening. It says he sleeps in 200 hotel rooms a night every year. Did I say that? I said that wrong. That takes some doing. Okay, you got the idea, right? 200 nights a year he sleeps in a hotel room. His main takeaway is that stereotypes are not helping us. For example, he says, Democrats usually think of MAGA types as, here it goes, men who wear camo, drive a pickup truck, own guns, were raised Southern Baptist, and drink Pabst Blue Ribbon beer. That's a stereotype, right? Breaking that stereotype, he says he met a lesbian biker at a Trump rally, and that woman had become a Sufi Muslim after surviving a plane crash. Right? He told of another fellow he met at a similar rally in South Dakota. The fellow said to David Brooks, "Let me tell you about the best day of my life." He was 70 years old, talking to David. He said 35 years before, he'd been working at a plant of some kind, doing really good work. The plant decided to do some downsizing, so they let him go. But he was known to everyone in the plant as a really good guy. He said the day he was given his last check, 3,500 fellow workers at the plant made 2 lines from the station he worked at to the door of the plant, and they stood there and they cheered him and they loved on him as he went out the door. 3,500 of his team. It meant everything to him, he said. And since then, he had gone from one lesser job to another. 35 years of working for less money, less meaning, less camaraderie. Disappointment leads to discontent, which leads to depression, and finally, disgust. What we had a week or so ago was a massive example of disgust. Can we just begin to try to understand one another? I think that most of us, getting back to the text today, this is right out of the lectionary, I think that most of us are more like Elkanah, the husband of Hannah, right? Than we are like Hannah. Most of us are clueless about the divide in our country. If last week's election proved anything, I think it proved that. I'm definitely clueless. Here's something that surprised me. Joe Biden got a lot bigger share of votes from women in 2020 than Kamala Harris got this year. Who saw that coming? What in the world does that say about who we are as a nation in 2024? A good number of us feel like we've been hit by a truck, and we are still on the pavement, and we are bleeding, and we don't know if we will even survive as a democratic nation. Constitution is heading for the dump. The ambulance is coming, and we look at the future, and it looks like we might already be living in Putin's Russia. Well, let me close with a story by Rebecca Levenberg of Philadelphia, who literally got hit by a truck, and I think has something to teach us about dealing with sudden, catastrophic change in a world where we all are slow to understand one another. In fact, slow to understand even our own hearts. Here's what Rebecca says in her own words. 6 years ago, she says, I was hit by a truck while riding my bicycle to work, and I had to have my leg amputated. At the rehabilitation hospital, I was assigned a peer mentor. Rob was the first amputee I had ever met. When he offered to answer my questions, I had none. I was riddled with pain from a limb that wasn't there and overwhelmed by the change to my body. Though I felt obligated to listen to Rob, really, I just wanted him to go away. The one thing I remember about that meeting is that Rob had come by on his way home from the gym, where he went in the evenings after work. Rob went to the gym, Rob went to work, Rob was an amputee. This information gave me hope. Over the next year, she says, I learned to walk with a prosthetic leg. The second year brought more independence, and I went back to work and to the gym. That summer, a man waved me down on a city sidewalk. Can I ask you a question, he said, eyes fixed on my prosthesis. Sure, I replied. His voice got kind of quiet. Were you born that way? Were you born without your leg? I told him no, that I'd had my leg amputated after an accident. I wondered why he was asking. He had all four of his limbs. The man pointed to a nearby hospital and explained that his wife had just had a baby boy born without part of his arm. The doctor said, he'll never know the difference, the man said. Do you think that's true? He asked me. Do you think he'll never know? What could I say? I had no idea. We talked a bit more, and I asked if the baby was healthy, and the man said yes. "Congratulations," I said. "What's his name?" He told me, and for the first time since we'd begun talking, I saw a proud dad. After we parted, I realized that I was probably the first amputee he'd ever met. Walking away, I stood tall and confident, just in case he was watching. May God be with us in these days. Amen.